So the map of the study area is on the left. Like I said, it's 140,000 acres approximately. 13 peaks were given a trailless designation in the 70s approximately, and they've been managed as such since then. They were traditionally accessed by people who needed to navigate to them using a paper map and compass, and they required a higher level of navigational competency of the backcountry user. And this has changed over time as technology has improved. And in 2018, at a overuse meeting, a stakeholder brought to the department an anecdotal report that informal trails had in fact started developing on some of these summits. And so the department responded quickly, and we recognized we needed to start a baseline data collection effort in these areas. And so during the winter of 2019, we started looking at ways that we could begin monitoring. The study area is very large, and we wanted to start to identify the locations and conditions of informal trail networks, also begin to understand the type, the timing, the distribution of visitation that was occurring in these areas. And we wanted to understand the factors that were influencing visitation. And two things became apparent rather quickly. The first was that there is a growing number of hiking challenges in the Catskills that are driving people to these areas during times of years that were previously undesirable times to travel there. And at the same time, the availability of hiking apps and GPS tracks and technological aids that hikers can use to get to these summits have opened up these areas to people that previously would not have had the experience or navigational competency to make it to these summits. So I just wanted to touch briefly on why informal trail impacts are concerning. On the left, you have a host of undesirable characteristics that are associated with informal trails. On the right, however, you have a picture of an informal trail that's leading to Catskill High Peak. And the thing that makes these types of trails difficult and unsustainable is that they're typically the shortest distance between 2 points. So they erode much more quickly than a sustainably designed trail or a deliberately designed trail, and they can ultimately result in a very undesirable hiking experience for the hiker, while also having significant natural resource impacts. So this is the first two images that I've included in my slide that shows Strava heat map data. And I just wanted to illustrate for you the landscape level impacts of informal trails versus formal trails. On the left, we have a very, very popular trail that leads to the summit of Slide Mountain, which is the highest peak in the Catskills. And as you can see, the Strava heat map data, what it does is it aggregates its user data. So it records where people walk, run, or bike. And then based on that information, it creates these heat maps where it shows hot activity or where the travel is concentrated. And so on the left, you can see that while the trail is very highly used, the use is concentrated to a single corridor. On the right, we have the Strava heat map information for Rocky, which has been managed as trailless. And as you can see, the herd path net distribution on that peak is significant in terms of its impact on the landscape. It's much more extensive. So when we were preparing to start our data collection, we realized that this was a massive study area and we needed to be strategic about how we were going to approach areas to monitor. And I mentioned Strava data. Like I said, it's a fitness app, so it wasn't used for this type of work, but what it did show us is that it showed us where people were traveling. The limitation to this is that it only reflects the visitation patterns of people that are using the app. So it's important to remember that any of the maps you see tonight that show Strava data are actually an underrepresentation of the use that's happening on the ground. On the left, you can see the informal trail network as represented by Strava leading up to Balsam Cap and Friday Mountain in the Slide Mountain Wilderness area. And so we began to realize that this Strava heat map data we could use to start to just look from our desktop where people were approaching these summits. And then we asked, well, was there a correlation with the popular hiking apps? And it turns out there was. So we were able to very quickly identify areas for monitoring in the 2019 field season, basically from our desktop, which saves staff time and resources. So I wanted to show you a quick chart of, or two charts of the visitation information that we obtain from canister sign-ins through a volunteer stewardship agreement with the Catskill 3500 Club. And a canister, for those of you that haven't been to the summit of these trailless peaks, is simply a small container that hikers sign in at once they've reached the summit. And then at the end of the year, the Catskill 3500 Club provides this sign-in information with the department. And so on the left, you have the total sign-in numbers for the 13 peaks from 2009 to 2021. And as you can see, we've seen some pretty significant increases in sign-ins. The most substantial jump was obviously in 2019 to 2020 during the pandemic, where use exploded in these areas. Again, we don't know what percentage of hikers actually do sign in at the canisters. So we're not exactly sure how representative it is, but it's a good baseline for us to start to understand how the visitation is changing in these areas. And on the right, I just have the breakdown of sign-in information by peak and the increases from 2009 to 2020. I've highlighted 3 boxes where we have seen increases of over 500% in visitation on some of these summits. So once we identified where we wanted to go, we needed to figure out what monitoring protocols that we were going to use. And as luck would have it, we did not have to reinvent the wheel, because an informal trail monitoring protocol had been developed by for the National Park Service for Denali and Acadia for monitoring informal trail networks in those national parks by Jeff Marion and his colleagues. And so we applied this monitoring protocol to segments of informal trails in the Catskills on the trailless peaks. And there's 5 different classifications, and segments of trail are rated according to where they fall in this classification scheme, from class 1 to class 5. And I want you to take a close look at each one of these pictures and keep them in mind as I start to show you some Strava heat map data. So this is an image of the Strava heat map information that was taken in 2019 of Rocky Mountain, Lone Mountain, and the Slide Mountain Wilderness. And what you'll notice in this picture is that most of the network is represented in purple or dark red with a little bit of orange. And that's really consistent with what we were seeing with class 1, class 2 types of informal trails. But as we moved into 2020, we saw an explosion of use, and we saw transitioning of certain segments of trail from, what would be class 1 or class 2 into the heavier used trail segments are now starting to show up as yellow and orange, and they're basically transitioning into more degraded condition classes. We also saw tremendous new use up in the upper right-hand corner over here, just with more diffuse bushwhacking, hiking, and visitation to areas that had previously experienced no visitation. Again, here is a heat map from August of 2022. 2021. Now we start to see that not only are that there's heavier use along the major segments of these trails, but there's duplicative herd paths that are now starting to receive heavy use, particularly within the summit between Rocky and Lone Mountain. And we began to see travel from the Burroughs Range trails over Dink Mountain and into Friday. So a brand new herd path, which we expect is related to a hiking challenge. And here we have, this is the heat map information for 2022. again, what we're just seeing is more and more entrenched and incised and degraded trails that are experiencing heavier and heavier use based on our data collection that we conducted in the field, and the information that we're getting from the Strava heat maps. So I just, before I end, I wanted to say that we've documented a rapid rate of change in the distribution and condition of the informal trails. We have monitoring results that have indicated that the current levels of visitation are occurring at levels that are not sustainable. We recognize that management interventions will be necessary on formerly trailless peaks to prevent long-term natural resource damage. And the VUM planning process, or the visitor use management planning process, has been identified as the appropriate planning mechanism that will allow us to expedite our responses to the natural resource degradation that have been documented over the course of the last 4 years. And I'll also say that using this planning process aligns nicely with recommendations from the High Peaks Advisory Group and the preliminary recommendations from the Catskill Advisory Group that the DEC integrate the visitor use management planning model into our efforts to manage high use areas, as it's the federal standard for planning for those types of intensely used areas. So the next steps in the VUM process, we've been gathering data and building the foundation since 2019 on the visitation patterns and the changing conditions in these areas. And the next step is we really want to engage with the public and get a sense of the public's desired conditions for these areas and what their expectations are for their recreational experiences there. So we're going to provide opportunities for enhanced public outreach and engagement. We will be identifying management actions that will be customized for multiple zones within the study area that will involve DEC's monitoring results, the scientific findings from New York Natural Heritage Program, which Max Henschel will be presenting on, and the informal management strategies that have worked successfully in national parks, which Dr. Jeffrey Marion will speak to. And ultimately, the next step is to draft and provide a draft visitor use management plan that will be developed for these areas and presented to the public, accompanied by a public comment period. We expect that we will be able to hold that meeting and present that preliminary plan at some point this winter. And that's my presentation and my contact information, and I'm happy to take any questions now or later on.
Pine, could you just go back to one of your heat maps, any one, and just talk a little bit about how to read the heat map again, when any one of these. So when you're looking at, because we had somebody asking about this, the yellow, like just the various colors, how you're reading them.
So basically the activity is represented on a scale from dark to light, and the darker lines that you see reflect lighter use. But as you get towards the lighter colors, that's where the use gets heavier.
Great. So like those white lines are where we know that a lot of people using this one particular app called Strava have hiked.
Yeah, so this white line in the lower left-hand corner is an actually designated trail.
Got it. Perfect.
So that's why you see that the white is typically associated with a designated trail, because that's where everybody's traveling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for referring to that. And then can we go back to the 5 trail classes just to look at those for one more second, and then we will hand it off to Max next, unless folks, you can continue to drop questions in the Q&A widget for Pine, and we can come back to them later. But once we'll move forward here in just a moment. And Pine, Stash is asking, do you have any sense of how many people, like how many people contributed to the data in Strava?
We're really wrestling with that.
Okay.
We did have a trailhead survey that was conducted this summer that asked one simple question to hikers: were you using a hiking app? And roughly, I think about 40% were. And then they were asked what type of app they were using. And Strava was not the most popular, All Trails was.
Got it.
And we're really trying to figure out a way to understand how representative the Strava heat map information is of the actual use. It's something we're really grappling with right now, but we don't have an answer.
Thank you. And then I'm guessing, we've got somebody asking about where on this spectrum, class 1 through 5, the formerly trailless peaks fall. Now, does that change from peak to peak, trail to trail, as far as whether we're
Yes.
seeing class 1 or more class 5, or
Yeah.
definitely, is there a clear, we see
No.
more type? Okay.
So every mountain will have multiple, scenarios of these classifications. I mean, some mountains don't have class 5 trails. All of them have class 1 through class 4. But it depends on, the segment length is all different. So it really depends.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Pine. And maybe if you wouldn't mind, we've got somebody asking for your contact information. We're going to move on to Max's, but perhaps you could just drop in the chat, because you as a panelist can send that to everybody. If you would just drop your contact info, and Max, take it away. And Pine, I'll stop sharing her screen so Max can share his. Thanks, Pine. That was awesome.
Okay, thanks everybody. Just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
We can see that you there we go.
Yeah.
It just took a minute. There was just a lag. We got you.
Okay, great. All right. Hi, I'm Max Henschel, ecologist of the New York Natural Heritage Program. We've been working with DEC on evaluating the effects of informal recreational trails on plants, animals, and natural communities in the Catskills over the last 3 years. Tonight, I'll give a brief overview of what we found during these surveys. So first, a little background on, there we go, on the natural communities of Catskill Park. The area of natural cover in the park can be kind of thought of as a huge as a huge chocolate chip cookie. The matrix of the forest, the matrix forest, the beech maple music, and hemlock northern hardwood forest can be thought of as the dough of the cookie and account for the bulk of the natural cover in the park. Then there are smaller natural communities interspersed within the matrix forest, which represent the chocolate chips of the natural community cookie. The chocolate chip communities that are most often associated with the informal trails in the Catskills are the montane forest, the mountain spruce fir forest, and the mountain fir forest, which generally occur above 3,500 feet above sea level or higher. In the image on the slide, you can see the dough of the beech maple music forest with a single chocolate chip of mountain fir forest in the bottom left corner. The structure of the natural communities is important in this project because of where the trails lie. Most, if not all, of the informal trails start in the matrix forest and proceed upslope. In the image on the slide, the purple lines are the paths of the ITs going up North Dome. The summit here is high enough that it actually transitions into one of these chocolate chip natural communities of mountain fir forest. And of course, since the original hiking challenge in the Catskills was for peaks over 3,500, we have pretty good alignment between potential montane forests and the peaks that we are interested in this project. So here's a map of all the areas in Catskill Park over 3,500 feet in pink. And if we overlay our known occurrences of these two montane forests in the Catskills, we have pretty good alignment. In fact, 12 of the 16 peaks that we surveyed have montane forests at the summit. So over the course of the last 3 years, we've surveyed these 16 peaks that have the informal trails leading to their summits. So I'll talk about the conditions of the natural communities on a few of these peaks. First, on the list is Southwest Hunter. The approach is a fairly level trail through mountain fir forest, about 1 meter wide with no significant erosion. You can see in the picture. Near the summit, the trail turns straight upslope and has been eroded several feet below the surface of the surrounding forest, as seen in the picture on the slide. At the summit, we see exposed soil, bare roots, rocks, and a loss of vegetation within about 20 meters of the canister. There are also additional trails that we found that go farther away from the canister, away from the main trail, further dissecting the mountain fir forest on the summit. On Catskill Peak, the Informal trail is nearly straight upslope its entire course. In the steepest area of the slope, in the picture in the center of the slide, the trail has been eroded to bedrock. Even in less steep areas, we find the tread of the trail is well below the level of the surrounding forest, as you can see in the picture on the right. And in the vicinity of the canister, the organic soil layer is gone, exposing roots, soil, and bedrock. The summit has numerous paths crisscrossing it, resulting in the loss of forest understory throughout much of the natural community. The lower trail to Balsam Cap and Friday is primarily through beech maple music forest, one of our matrix forests. The impacts range from minimal through dry areas with little vegetation, shown in the middle picture, compared to erosion and exposed roots in areas that are more moist. The trail up to the summit of Friday is very steep. There is extensive damage within the mountain spruce fir forest near the summit, including erosion and exposed roots and rocks, shown in the middle picture, as well as broken roots and stems that have been used as slides and handholds and have eroded from due to use, as shown in the picture on the right. And at the summit of Friday, we again see exposed soil, roots, rocks, and the complete loss of vegetation, particularly near the canister. And there are even several trees that have been removed from the peak. On Lone Mountain, the Informal trail passes through beech maple music forest up to about 3,500 feet. There is moderate impact in the beech maple music forest due to this IED. And you can see the Informal trail in the picture on the right. It's maybe around a class 2 or 3 on the trail condition assessment. So once in the mountain fir forest above 3,500 feet, on the upper approach to Lone Mountain, there's a well-defined moderate to moderately high impact herd trail, still somewhere in the category 2 or 3 of trail conditions, as Pine described. And again, at the summit, similar to the other peaks, there's extensive trampling causing root exposure, damage to the soil and organic layer, and a loss of vegetation. The mountain fir forest at the summit of Lone is highly fragmented by a maze of trampled herd paths, resulting in a loss of understory vegetation throughout much of the peak. As Pine showed in the Strava heat maps, the route between Lone and Rocky it can be a little bit amorphous. There's one fairly well-defined trail through most of the call, which is shown in the picture on the right. But there are numerous herd paths crisscrossing through this area, disappearing and reappearing and fragmenting this mountain spruce fir forest. So this image just shows what the typical conditions look like for a trail that's on relatively level ground through the mountain fir forest near the summits of the peaks.
Hey, Max, can I just
Yes.
ask a quick question? Linda's in
Sure.
Q&A, and she's wondering, she mentioned how you've said a couple times that people are removing trees, and she's just wondering if we have a sense of who or why.
We do not. That may be a question that Pine could answer at the end of the presentation, but it looks like they've been cut. So that's the best answer I can give.
Okay, no, thank you very much.
So here's an image at the summit of Rocky Mountain. Again, all the understory vegetation has been eliminated through trampling and use, and the organic top layer of soil is being impacted. If you look in the back of the picture, in the background of the picture, you can actually see what you should expect to see on the top of this mountain. So you can see that there's a huge change in forest structure on this peak. And it's, again, similar to many of the other peaks where in the background of the pictures, you could see what the natural conditions should be. So that wraps up what I was going to present on the peak conditions. In terms of rare species, there are a few areas that are now closed to the public that had threatened and endangered plants. But as I said, they're closed to the public, so those weren't surveyed. But there's one more threatened and endangered species in the Catskills whose habitat is the montane forest found on many of the peaks. And that's the Bicknell's thrush. The Bicknell's thrush was originally discovered on Slide Mountain in the Catskills in 1885, and it was described as a subspecies of the gray cheek thrush at the time. It wasn't actually until 1995 that it was recognized as a distinct species. Bicknell's thrush nests in dense stands of regenerating fir. This habitat is restricted to the high elevation fir forests in the Northeast United States and the stunted conifer forests along the northern St. Lawrence River and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. As you can see on this map from eBird, the Catskills is actually the southernmost breeding location for Bicknell's thrush. And Bicknell's thrush habitat in the Catskills are these montane forests, particularly mountain fir forests that I've talked about throughout the presentation, as shown here in blue. Of the two records that we have of Bicknell's thrush from trailless peaks, neither were detected during the surveys that we completed during this project. The mountain fir forest at one of the summits that had previously had known Bicknell's thrush occurrence was highly disturbed with numerous informal trails and with the expected density of understory balsam fir now missing. However, more research is needed to really understand how recreational use of these peaks is affecting Bicknell's thrush and montane bird communities. So we can sum up the ecological damage we observed on the trailless peaks with a couple of points. First, the damage to the natural communities on the peaks is localized, and that is primarily within the tread or close to the tread of the informal trail. Though where there's areas that have multiple trails crisscrossing within a small area, the damage is much more extensive. We primarily see loss of vegetation and erosion as the major ecological damage in these areas. This damage is concentrated to where slopes are the steepest. These areas have high erosion potential, and once the vegetation and organic soil layers have been removed by trampling, then the erosion becomes an issue, and that's where you start to develop these category 5 trails that Pine described. We also see extensive damage at the summits near the canister. This is the one spot on the peak where people are actually spending the most time. Having just climbed a mountain, they're taking a rest, having a snack, stretching, doing whatever hikers do at the top of the peak. So the summits for 12 of the 16 peaks have montane forests, and they're probably the most sensitive natural communities that the trails cross through. We see multiple trails crisscrossing many of these communities, often resulting in a loss of understory and organic soil and the organic soil layer, especially in the vicinity of the canister, and that is exposing rock, soil, and roots. These changes in the structure of the montane forest may be affecting one of the Catskills' most iconic species, the Bicknell's thrush, but more research is needed to understand how the use of these trails and changes to natural communities affecting the occurrence of Bicknell's thrush and other montane bird species. That's the information I'm presenting tonight on impacts to natural resources on the peaks. I'd like to thank Elizabeth Spencer and Andrea Kornblau for conducting the bulk of the field work on this project. Here's my contact information if you'd like to reach out to me about this or any of the other work that Natural Heritage does. Thank you.
Max, that's thank you so much for sharing. One thing I'll ask, if you would also drop your contact information in the chat so that as we move forward, folks know where to find you. So we've got a couple questions that have come in. One is, do we have a sense of how much area of first growth or primary forest has been seriously impacted by this erosion, by informal herd paths?
I can say that in the places that I went, I wouldn't say that there's any first growth or primary forest on those peaks. We do know of areas in the Catskills that do have primary forest, but as far as I know, no informal trails pass through them,
Got it. Great. Thank you.
which is good.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you. And then we've got Josh asking about, as we're looking to where people are going or why, he's wondering if there's been any research into the relationship if eBird or birding activity is promoting some of these informal trails as we try to get our hands around what users are coming out here the most. Has anybody looked into that?
Not that I know of, but I think some of Pine's trailhead surveys pointed to that most people are actually coming out for exercise. Pine could speak better to that than I could, but I think that the people coming out to look for rare birds or going birding is probably a small group, or they're doing it in conjunction with another activity. So.
Cool. Pine, did you want to speak to that, or did Max cover that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a very small percentage of people that are visiting these areas.
Got it. Cool. Thank you so much. And then great. And we've got a couple other questions that'll hold till the end so that we got time, because I know our next presenter has such great information. So folks who are typing in questions, keep them coming, and we're going to work to get back to them toward the end. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay, let's see if I got the right screen here. All right, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so a little bit more about myself. As I mentioned, I'm a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Originally, I was with the National Park Service, and they moved all of us over to the USGS. I am a recreation ecologist, and I have a slide on that in just a minute. Personally, I'm sort of a lifelong outdoor recreationist. I would say that my favorite activities are hiking, backpacking, and canyoneering, but I also do a lot of rock climbing and canoeing and other kinds of things as well. I have been a youth leader with the Boy Scout troop for about 5 years, and then a venture crew, which is co-ed, for 18 years. So I do a lot of work with the youth. And then finally, I was a founding board member of Leave No Trace, and I chaired the committee back in the 90s that developed and refined a lot of the Leave No Trace practices. And in 2014, I authored their official book, and you can find that on Amazon if you're interested. So with that as by way of background, I'll go ahead and jump in. As I mentioned, I'm stationed here at Virginia Tech University. And we do this recreation ecology research, and there's perhaps only, I don't know, 10 or 12 people in the world that would introduce themselves as a recreation ecologist. It's an extremely small field of study. But we evaluate visitor impacts. Typically, we're looking at campsites and trails, but we also look at other kinds of attributes out there. But trail science is a pretty solid component of recreation ecology research, and I've done probably more of those kinds of studies than any of my colleagues. The application of this work is to both measure and describe these impacts that occur. Predominantly, we focus in on vegetation and soil impacts, but some other ecologists look at wildlife impacts and water quality impacts. My work has been predominantly with vegetation and soils. We do a lot of statistical modeling to try to understand the factors that influence the extent of impact, so that managers can then manipulate those factors to both sustain the recreational visitation while minimizing or avoiding the associated resource impacts. And that's the objective, I would say, of our research. And finally, I do a lot of consulting with managers to try to help them do their jobs better. And I think the best decisions are made when scientists and managers and visitors all get together and discuss these kinds of problems and challenges and come up with, you know, the most optimal sustainable solutions. And I'll be talking about the management toolbox sort of near the end. But in terms of objectives, you know, I'll review some of our findings, show you a lot of really cool pictures of informal trail impacts in this case, which is the focus of our talk tonight. Briefly review some of these impacts from the Catskills. We've already covered that really. And then focus on sort of that management toolbox at the end is what might we do? We're going to end with discussion on that. Okay, so we're going to begin a little bit with just basic nomenclature. You know, from my perspective, there's way too many synonyms, particularly for informal trails, which is the language I like to use, or the term I like to use. But you can see a long list there of terms that lots of other people have used in lots of different places around the country and the world. And I've studied in quite a few different places around the US and internationally. But we added a new one just in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's Strava trails because of that app. You know, people are finding those trails and following them in the Strava app. You have a blue moving dot that is yourself superimposed on a map, which is also superimposed on all of the alignments that everyone else has hiked. And that's what you were seeing a little bit earlier. In terms of, you know, my preference, I like to keep it simple and just call them formal trails. Some people call them designated trails, but formal trails, and then informal are these trails that are created by, you know, visitors or perhaps by some other purpose, but then, you know, kept open and kept there, you know, kept present by visitor use. So it might be an old logging route that the managers wanted to close down and restore or recover, but visitors keep using that old logging route and keep it open and you know, used as a trail. Formal trail systems generally are built to allow visitors to access most of the most important destinations, you know, that they want to go visit in a protected area. So trail networks are the transportation network, basically. But you can always, you know, sort of consider that there are some activities that have lower levels of use and visitation, where the managers just don't want to provide a designated formal trail. And so, you know, you're always going to have some of these informal trails, these visitor created trails out there. And the question is, you know, how many are there and what kind of condition are they in? You know, are they in good condition? Or are they in degraded condition? And that's when they become a problem. And today, you know, we're dealing with a situation where these trails have gotten, you know, starting to get into the unacceptable range. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So like I said, we've studied these in a lot of different places. One of the things that we keep finding again and again is that these informal visitor created trails are generally not sustainably designed. You know, people are just kind of, oh, look, there's a hill, I think I'll walk up to the top of it. And they pretty much go straight up the fall line. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And they don't know much about, you know, whether this vegetation type is resistant and resilient versus another vegetation type. You know, plant ecologists, and that's my formal training, you know, recognize that there's a great variability in the vegetation resistance to trampling and its ability to recover its resilience from trampling. And so we've done these studies in lots of different parks. Here's a photo from Acadia National Park. We did a lot of these assessments in Haleakala National Park in Maui, Hawaii, literally on the summit of the Haleakala volcano. And then here's some pictures from Denali National Park, which is sort of supposed to be a trailless park. The managers would like it to be that way, but the visitors have something else in mind. And so we've sort of summarized with a number of bullets here some of the concerns that managers have for informal trails. In many cases, they're avoidable impacts because the alignments are not sustainable, are very sensitive. And of course, they lack maintenance. Most park managers don't go out and maintain these informal trail networks. Lots of times there's duplicative routings. There's like 5 or 6 different paths that go to the same place. And if you had a formal trail, you could avoid that and you'd have less aggregate impact from trampling with a formal trail than you would if you leave it to the visitors to create multiple informal trails. And you saw that with the Strava maps. Trampling impacts to veg, rare species, sensitive and natural and cultural features. A lot of times visitors don't recognize those rare and endangered species locations or the sensitive habitats. And so they're going to, possibly go right through those areas. And that's bad news for the managers. Wildlife disturbance, again, some rare species in some cases, or sensitive species perhaps. The fragmentation of wildlife habitat, when you have it intersected by all these different trails with people sort of showing up in unexpected places. Introduction, dispersal of non-native plants. Some of my colleagues have done surveys where they stop visitors coming into a protected area and they ask if they can search their clothing, their fleece, for example, for seeds, and their dog's fur for seeds, or maybe their boots and the dirt, caught in the treads of their boots or footwear. And they have documented hundreds and hundreds of seeds in these kinds of studies. There's just been a few of those studies done, but it's the results are a bit scary. And so, we're concerned about these things. The question is, are they at acceptable levels of impact, or are they, exceeding unacceptable levels of impact? And that's, quite frankly, that's not a scientific question. That's a management decision or judgment, basically. And so, as you saw, Pine and others are collecting data. They're starting to monitor these impacts, and they're starting to document, what are these changes that are occurring to vegetation, and how lineally extensive are they? Or if you add the width of trails, how, what's the sort of the aggregate, square meters of impact that's occurring? And so we're starting to document the different changes to vegetation cover. And then once that's gone to soils, which I'll get to in a second, but when these impacts occur in areas that are sensitive, these high subalpine, sort of zones where you have spruce fir forests that may be somewhat rare, particularly in New York State, then there's a greater concern. And particularly when you get these invasive plants that might be brought in by visitors and then dispersed. So the visitors can both introduce these species to these, backcountry, in some cases quite remote settings, but they can also, once they get, sort of their feet in the ground and they start growing, other visitors can come along and the seeds can, drop off on your shoes, on the top of your shoes, or collect on your clothing, and then be carried a mile before they drop off. And so we're dispersing these things. And here's a crew in one of the places where we did research, that's actively pulling weeds, and it's an incredibly time-consuming and frustratingly slow process. I've done a little bit of that myself. Once you erode or really disturb and remove the vegetation cover, you expose the underlying soils, and then you've got sort of the organic litter, the organic soil layer, and then with a lot of soil impact, you can get down to that mineral soil, sort of the deeper soil gets exposed and also eroded. And that's sort of the higher levels of that condition class that you saw that Pine presented. And so these are the kinds of impacts that occur on trails. The sort of 3 core impacts that we frequently measure in our studies are just trail widening. How wide is the trail? And there's sort of a design width, which might be a 1.5 feet wide or something. But some of these trails, when you go through a big mud hole, can be 15 feet wide. And so muddiness is another impact that can occur. And then soil loss, quite frankly, is the most significant, both ecologically significant, aesthetically significant, and managerially significant from the perspective that when that soil has to go somewhere. So it makes the trails harder to use, more dangerous to use, less attractive to use for visitors. And the soil loss is not going to be repaired in any easily addressed method. I mean, you pretty much have to bring soil back in by the wheelbarrow. So it's a more permanent form of impact, and some would call it downright impairment. And most managing agencies are mandated by Congress and to basically not have impairment. The park superintendents don't like it when I use that word. So trail sustainability, sort of the resource protection aspects of it is, what is a sustainable trail? When you keep throwing this term out, a sustainable trail, I would define as one that can accommodate the type and amount of use over time, long periods of time, without unacceptable levels of degradation or maintenance. And that, you get back into that acceptability factor again, is you're going to have some impact, some change if you're going to have recreational use. The challenge for managers is to prevent it from reaching into that unacceptable range. And again, it's a judgment, but we use a lot of techniques to go out and measure these things and monitor these things, and then we look at that data, and then it's a judgment call as to whether it's acceptable impact or whether it's reached an unacceptable level. Visitor-created informal trails, ITs, have been shown to be far less sustainable in their design. And obviously they weren't really designed. Visitors just walked them in, right? And as opposed to a formal trail, which may have at one time been, designed, hopefully sustainably designed. But quite frankly, we measure a lot of formal trail networks that have many, many impacts. And almost always the really bad, unacceptable impacts on formal trails occur in places where those trails are not sustainably designed. And so a reroute needs to be done, which can be time consuming and expensive. But the informal trails, almost by definition, are generally not sustainably designed. And we have bigger problems with those when they reach really high levels of use and impact. So trail science can help. We can identify the factors that influence trail degradation. We can identify the factors that managers can apply to make trails more sustainably designed. And finally, we can also talk a little bit about the management and maintenance of trails to keep them sustainable. In terms of management of visitors, whether it's regulations or education, and in terms of maintenance of the trail tread itself. There's a lot that can be done to make a trail more sustainable through maintenance. But the true sort of tried and true work that we do is we go out and we measure these things. So we often do sampling schemes, and we put up transects across the trails. We measure 20, 30 different things. We often take this data, almost always now, into the geographic information system world, so computerized mapping, and we can often create another 20 or 30 variables there, looking at the watershed attributes and looking at vegetation and soil types and all kinds of things that we can access in GIS. And we can then characterize, as I said, we often characterize these impacts. The data I'm showing below, I'm not going to talk about it, but it's summarizing conditions from the entire Appalachian Trail. We did a 4-year study, 3 years of field work, where we did a geographically representative sample of the Appalachian Trail. We had some 3,150 transects that were measured from Maine to Georgia. And we used that data to create the information below, in addition to a lot more, which I'm not going to share with you today. But we take that kind of data, and then we do modeling and statistical analyses with it, and then we publish journal articles. And I'm not going to get into that stuff tonight. I'm just going to share with you, this one sort of summary table where we've done these kinds of modeling studies in lots of different places, and this is sort of characteristic of the results generally. We tend to get 3 and 4 factors being highlighted in most of these studies as being the most influential, and I'm only going to talk about those 3 or 4 factors here. But trail grade is kind of the duh factor. Everyone knows that steep trails erode pretty quickly. Trail slope alignment, I'll have to explain that one a little more because a lot of people don't know much about it. Tread drainage is sort of another easy factor to understand. If you've got drainage features on your trail, You're going to get the water off the trail. The trail hopefully becomes hydrologically invisible to water flow across the landscape, and you don't get water erosion, digging down into that trail and exposing roots and rocks and creating, ravines and that sort of thing. So let's sort of visually look at that, just, some of these factors pretty quickly. We've all seen trails like this that go up a really steep slope. We just saw some of these in the two previous presentations by Pine and Max. And these two are on the Appalachian Trail. I've section hiked the entire Appalachian Trail. I'm now working on the Pacific Crest Trail out west. But sometimes you get really steep grades, and you do see eroded roots and rocks and gullies and things when you have those kinds of steep grades. This other factor that I mentioned is trail slope alignment angle, TSA. We often refer to it in our science studies, but it's essentially is how does the trail, how is it arrayed relative to the landform grade? So if you've got a hill slope, if the trail's going straight up the hill, like if you dumped a bucket of water on a hill, it would run straight down the fall line. And that's the worst, the least sustainably designed trail that you could possibly have. And if it's steep, it's even worse, right? And so the picture on the left here is a fall line trail, and you can see that both sides of that trail are actually higher than the tread itself. And people tend not to want to walk down in a, sort of an eroded, rutted, rocky tread that's in a ravine or a little gully. And so they do a lot more damage in terms of widening the trail, and they move laterally to widen the trail. In contrast, the trail on the right side is from Great Smokies, and it has a little bit of snow cover that makes it really pop. And it shows you that that's a nice, bench constructed side hill trail. And so water coming down that slope might hopefully hit that trail and move more slowly, but move across that tread and keep going downhill. In other words, the trail doesn't intercept and divert that water down the tread. That's our goal. Or we put in tread drainage features to prevent that movement of water down the tread. Sometimes a berm, quite frequently, quite frankly, a berm will form on that lower trail side that prevents water from flowing off. And so then you need these drainage features. I'll get back to those in a minute. But we've done a lot of modeling, a lot of statistical tests. You could read some of my journal articles if you really want to. I can send them to you or highlight some. But basically, this chart is going to summarize, and this is the last one I show. This chart sort of summarizes these relationships. And down on the bottom, we've categorized trail grade into three categories: 0 to 6% grade, 7 to 15%, and 16 to 50%. And then each line here represents a category of the TSA, or that trail slope alignment. So this line up here has transects which were all on trails that were fall lines. They're going straight up the fall line. If you dump a bucket of water, it's going to run down the fall line. So that's the least sustainable, the unsustainable trail alignment. This lowest line is the sort of side hill trail, pretty close to the contour line, perhaps, contour line being dead level. And so you have this 0 to 90 degrees. And so anything up in the 0 to 22 degrees is going really pretty much straight up the slope. And as you can see, this is eroded soil over on this left axis. This line here is higher than these other lines, which means fall line trails are the worst of the worst. And they get worse as they get steeper, that you're going from a 0 to 6% grade on a fall line trail to a 7 to 15% grade to a 16 to 20 or 16 to 50% grade here with these transects. And so you can see the effect of grade going from this point to that point. You see the effect of TSA, this trail slope alignment, by comparing this entire line to these other three lines. And what it shows you is that these other three lines are kind of okay, as long as they're not too steep. So trails that are, closer, that are not lined with the fall line are all, they're going to be angled up a slope, for example, or angled down a slope, for example. But those trails are all okay. They're side hill trails. The fall line trail is not side hill. It's going straight up the slope, and it's the worst of the worst, particularly if it's really steep. Okay, hopefully everyone pretty much picks up on that because I need to move on. And then the last, remember in that modeling chart I showed you, tread drainage was an issue. And so here's a slide just illustrating tread drainage. And it's illustrating the most sustainable type of tread drainage, which is called a trail or a tread grade reversal. And so the trail's coming downhill, and any water that it might be intercepting and carrying on its tread is coming downhill with it. But then the entire trail briefly turns and goes uphill, maybe 1.5 feet, perhaps. That's all it really takes, is maybe 1.5 feet uphill around the high side of this tree, and then resumes going back downhill again. Any water coming down this tread will be forced through the laws of physics to depart this trail. It will not be able to go uphill and around the tree and keep going, okay? Oftentimes we just dig ditches across the trail, and we call them water bars, whether they're wooden, sort of protected, or rock, protected, but they're water bars. And those are drainage features, but they have to be dug out and cleaned all the time, like twice a year minimum. This feature does not. So hence we're saying that this feature is more sustainable, doesn't really need maintenance. Here's another couple of factors over here on this picture on the right. We have this trail, which has been built using rock and angular gravel, and you can see that the tread is just really bomb-proof because of that. And we're showing that in some of our studies, other studies not as much. And I think we're just not as good as we need to be with our studies, quite frankly, because the amount of rock in the tread substrates is clearly a sustainability factor. And so trails with a lot of rock, particularly angular rock and gravel, as opposed to rounded, sort of interlocks and makes for a really bomb-proof tread. And so we use a lot of stonework on trails, particularly in steep areas, to make them highly, sort of hardened to use or more sustainable, basically. Okay, so just to summarize all of that before I move on to informal trails, is that a sustainable trail is sort of a full bench constructed side hill alignment. A side hill means that one side is lower than the other side. This side slope is high, this side slope is low. That's a side hill trail. It's a bench constructed. It has a sort of a level, gently outsloped bench generally. You can see on this one much better. But the steeper the side slopes, the better, because these steep side slopes just basically force or compel visitors to stay on the dang trail, right? I mean, you're not going to go walking off the trail if the side slope is like a 15 or a 30% grade. It's sort of self-centering, right? And then ideally you have either rocky, you can see rock here, or angular gravel type treads. Those are the best, most sustainable treads. Now, obviously, you can't always find all these attributes, but I'm telling you what would be the most sustainable trail. And then finally, a sustainable trail has an adequate density based on how steep it is of these tread drainage features, whether it's a tread grade reversal or a less sustainable feature like a water bar. It has to have a good density of those to periodically remove the water from the trail. All right, so with that as a background, I think now you can sort of think about some of the informal trails that you've been on. They probably don't have a lot of those attributes, which is what I had said before, is that visitor created informal trails generally are not very sustainable. So we did a big study on this at Potomac Gorge, which is an area just outside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. It was Park Service managed. And I'm going to show you just a little bit about of our data there. I'm not going to get into any statistics or anything, but what we did is we used a very expensive sub-meter accuracy, like accurate to 2 feet roughly, Trimble GPS unit. These things cost like $6,000 to $8,000. but they're highly accurate. And even though they're very accurate, you still get a sort of a network that looks like this. And some of the lines aren't always connected, and some of, it needs a little bit of editing. And so we have graduate students, thankfully, that do this kind of work. They edit this and produce a usable trail layer over here. So that's kind of the process. We go walk these things. And here's an image on the left that shows you along the Potomac River in the Potomac Gorge area, where we have formal trails, which are these cyan blue, lines. And then we have the informal visitor created trails in red. And you can see right off the bat that there's a lot of these informal trails. There's a lot of off-trail activity in this area. And in particular, this particular area is called Bear Island. It's co-owned by the Nature Conservancy. And why, you might ask? Because it has very, very high ecological value. There's like dozens of species of rare plants in this area. And so the Park Service, who manages this area along with the Nature Conservancy, is very alarmed about this. And in fact, when we looked at Bear Island, we ended up doing this survey and documenting that there's about 1.7 miles of formal trail, and there's about 9.5 miles of informal trail. And so the Park Service was right. They have some real problems here because all these informal trails are occurring in habitat which is very sensitive for rare species. And so, we essentially did a lot of analysis with the data. We, categorize the data by park zones. They have different zoning classes, and the Catskill Park has some zoning classes as well. We'll get to those in a minute. We were able to summarize a little bit of this. So for example, for the entire park, 49 kilometers of formal trails, but 47 kilometers of informal trails. And the park staff basically said that is entirely unacceptable. We need to do something about that. And then aggregate, you can also put in that third dimension, the width of the trails, and you get 14,205 square meters, which equates to about 3.5 acres of intensively impacted terrain under these informal trail networks. We also did some work in GIS on this mapping package, the computer mapping package, where we assigned the widths for these different trails that we mapped. And so if it was a really wide trail, it got a wide width versus the really, the like condition class 1 or 2 trail, which are very narrow. But then we buffered them. We buffered all of the trails to look at the potential effect to wildlife. Because, if you're a bird or a small mammal or something like that, and you're within, 10, 15 feet of a trail, you're probably going to run away and be displaced when a visitor walks down that trail. And so there's sort of a displacement area. And obviously, if you have a big, huge network, as you saw in those Strava maps, the displacement area becomes quite large, potentially. Now, it depends on how frequently those trails are used, but it's a concern. And obviously, the displacement area is much larger if you have dispersed use than if you have everyone walking on a single formal trail. Wildlife tend to be able to adapt to consistent, heavy use on a single trail. But when I saw this Strava map that Pine sent me, it was pretty alarming. I'm going to be frank and honest with you. As a professional who works with the National Park Service all the time, my whole career, like 35 years now, I'll be retiring at the end of next year. I looked at this and said, wow, that's a little sobering. Now, on the one hand, when you have really dispersed traffic like this area, it's not so bad. I mean, a few people a year might go into some of these dispersed areas, and that's okay. So we call that sort of a dispersal strategy. And we get into this in Leave No Trace as well. Dispersal is kind of a good thing. But when you get into more concentrated traffic like these areas, and certainly these areas here, now you're talking some real impact. Some actual trails are going to show up on the ground. And in many cases, you'll have multiple trails that are sort of braided and they're all going to the same place, basically. And so when I look at this kind of an area, I say, okay, dispersal is not working here. We have way too much use. We really need to shift that use to a sustainably designed formal trail. And what you've got here right now is a recipe for, quite frankly, disaster. And when I say disaster, I mean unacceptable conditions. And so, it's been caught, perhaps early enough, although I look at this and say, yeah, not really. But certainly we need to begin to address this. These are no longer trailless peaks. And let's just look at some of the enabling legislation here, some of the management guidance that that hasn't really fully been shared. I'm going to not spend much time on it, but in terms of mandates, these protected protected land agencies, they have a mandate to in this case, these lands shall be forever kept as wild forest lands, and you'll go through this and talk about how pristine they are, and that high degrees of degradation will not be acceptable, and so on and so forth. No different really from the National Park Service or the U.S. Forest Service wilderness management mandates. There is an infrastructure, in other words, they have like 925 campsites and 417 miles of formal trails. But then you're getting all these informal trails, which are not part of this. They're on top of that. They do have land classifications or zoning, and here are those categories: intensive use, administrative, primitive, bicycle corridor. And then most of these trailless peaks are in these last two, almost all of them, wilderness and wild forest. And when I looked at the guidance for that, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the next slide. They talk about monitoring this recreational use and traffic, and they do talk about here unacceptable physical impacts. At some point, the impacts could reach that level, and appropriate management actions, generally shall be taken at that point. Will be taken, not should be, but shall or will be taken is usually the language you see in these documents. And as I said, for wilderness and wild forests, you have a higher level of protection, and that's where these trailless peaks and summits are located, is in these more protected categories of their zoning. And it says no new trails will run through important areas of ecological significance. So the rare Bicknell thrush, where it nests, is in these high elevation sort of subalpine forests, which is where everyone's going with these trails, is to these summits. And so there is a overlap there of intensive use and trampling and rare, in this case, a rare bird. And so there's there's a real conflict there that needs to be managed, in addition to just simply the vegetative and soil impacts. And there may be some rare plants as well. But at any rate, it talks about 1/2 mile of the summit of a trailless peak over 3,500 feet, so on and so forth. And so the agency does have essentially a mandate here to either close this use down and restore the natural, pristine conditions, or if we're going to continue having this much use, it's my professional judgment that you really absolutely need to, get away from the informal trails and put in a sustainably designed, professionally, designated or professionally constructed rather, and maintained formal trail. In other words, the current situation is pretty much unacceptable, again, in my professional judgment. Allowing sort of these informal trails to run amok is less protective than if you had a professionally designed and constructed sustainable trail to replace them. And so therein lies the problem. So let's just again take a few pictures here. You can see that in terms of these trailless summits, that's no longer the case. They now have vegetation loss. They have clear trails. Here's a lot of vegetation loss on this particular peak. Here's soil loss that's occurring. We saw this picture earlier. here. And, quite frankly, it's also quite dangerous. There's some people who feel like, oh, I need to hike all these summit, these trailless peaks, and they're going straight up the hill on these fairly dangerous, kind of rock outcrops and things. And a nice side hill trail would be much safer if we again were to build a formal trail that's sustainable. No formal sustainable trail would look like these two pictures. These are clearly informal trails that really should not exist at the level of use that they are receiving. Okay, so moving along, what might we do? What's the toolbox that managers might look at in terms of best management practices? And so I've tried to capture, just 4 bullets here that seem to me to be the most. I mean, the toolbox has 50 tools in it. I've pulled out sort of 4 bullets here that I think capture probably the best management practice for your unique situation. And the first step I would suggest to you would be to evaluate and assess the sustainability of your, both your formal and your informal trail system or network in these areas. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of the formal trails are also not sustainably designed in places, and those should also be fixed. And then second, design and construct sustainable trails and or do relocation. Sometimes it's just a 300-yard section of a trail that needs to be relocated and to a more sustainable alignment. So the most of the trail is fine, except for bits and pieces here and there. In other cases, you've got entire informal trail networks going to these trailless peaks. And I would suggest to you that there may, but after looking at the Strava maps, I'm not so certain about that, but there may be some segments of the informal trail network that's currently existing that might be sufficiently sustainable to continue using them in the interim period. And that would be until the managing agency and or hiking clubs and other, stewards, like the Appalachian Trail is almost entirely managed and maintained by not informal, by volunteer trail clubs. And so there are trail clubs in this area. They could jump in and help begin to correct this situation. They could come in and help identify what are the most sustainable routes up each of these trailless peaks, trailless, quote unquote, and could we highlight those sustainable routes and try to get people to use them by either on the ground blazing or perhaps by including them in a trail app that everyone would start using. In other words, it would no longer be the Strava map showing you 20 different routes up the mountain. It would be some sort of a phone app that would show you the most sustainable existing routes at the current time. And it would encourage people to stay on those routes. And then as money and staffing and time is permitting, these temporarily used routes would be replaced by more sustainably designed and professionally constructed routes. It's going to take time. It's, being pragmatic. And so we would then create and maintain these durable treads, these sustainable treads, and we'd add drainage features where necessary. That's one of the problems with informal trails that go straight up the fall line steeply. You can't drain them. It's physically impossible. You're defying the laws of physics, trust me. And so you have to have a sustainable route if you're going to try to drain it. And steep fall line routes can't be drained. It's almost by definition. But at any rate, you create these sustainable networks, and then you try to get people to use only those networks. And it's a concentration, or you're focusing all of the use on the most sustainable routes, and so you're moving towards kind of a formal trail. And then you try to go out and close and prevent the use of all these other routes, all these other non-sustainable routes, and allow them to recover. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I'm suggesting here. And again, I'm just suggesting. I'm a scientist. I don't, I'm not out there doing, although I have maintained trail for the last 30 years. I have lots of experience in trail maintenance as well. So what are some of these sustainability attributes, and what is some of the guidance? Well, many of you who are in trails that might be in hiking clubs that maintain trails have seen charts very much like this one. This is from the Forest Service. It's not actually based on good research. None of them are yet, but it's something that I would agree with. You pretty much want to stay away from flat terrain because, trail widening and muddiness are often going to be problems, chronic problems. So you want some slope, and then you want a side hill trail on whatever slope you have. So it's an angled trail that's going up and down a slope. And once you get up to around 11 to 15%, even having an angled side hill trail is often not sufficient. It often won't really be completely sustainable unless the tread substrates are mostly rock, angular rock. And certainly as you get above 15%, you really need to be on rock or on a really durable, sort of angular gravel and rock tread. Or just simply break down and put in, tread steps, put in, rock staircases and things. And then drainage, kind of goes with that steepness of grade. And then we've produced a table on trail slope alignment angle here that we've published in a journal paper, and it gives you a little more information. Again, I don't really have time to go through this in detail, but you get the gist of it. The cross-sectional profile of these different trails. But the side hill trail looks like that. That's what now we've, again, I don't have time to go into this either, but we've actually developed a trail classification and rating scheme based on trail grade and based on trail slope alignment angle, broken down into 4 categories of each. And then you get this matrix, and we've assigned sort of trail sustainability ratings to each cell of the matrix. And you can then very easily, sort of apply this and come up with sort of these ratings. And again, I just don't have time to go into detail on that. I can send you a paper or two. But you can lay that onto a map and show that, here's a trail that goes straight up the fall line pretty much, very steeply, and it's in red, which means it's unsustainable. Same thing here. Here's a trail that's more side hill, and it's in green. It's sort of an angled, low grade side hill trail, and it's in green. And so you could apply this in the GIS environment in using a GIS, and to sort of rate and rank your existing trails, whether they be formal or informal. And then you could then get a trail professional to come in and do this kind of work and help you start to shift use to the most sustainably designed trails that you have, and as you wait to then build more that are more sustainable. Visitor education, there's some things that can be done there in terms of sort of leave no trace. Just simply communicating to visitors that off-trail trampling impacts are a problem in this area, particularly for the Bicknell thrush and some of the rare plants and sensitive plant communities. Off-trail hiking has created miles of, in many cases, duplicative ITs. In other words, 3 or 4 or 5 or even 10 or 12 trails going up each mountain. And this notion that you should hike mountains from different cardinal directions is just craziness. We need to have one good sustainable trail up to the top of a mountain and down, maybe to the other side to another peak beyond that. But that's it. 2 trails, one going up, one going down, or it could be an out and back using the same trail. That would be even better. And it should be an angled, sustainably designed trail. Remaining on these sustainable trails is what's going to protect the park resources, the vegetation, the soil, the wildlife. And then all sustainably designed trails should be blazed so that people can find them on the ground, and ideally included in a phone app so that people can use that to safely navigate. People are using these apps more and more frequently. And from my perspective, they're wonderful because you can identify sustainable trails in them. You can identify sustainable camping locations in them, and the visitors can then use them for navigation to those sustainable, infrastructure components. Let's see what else. Oftentimes, we use a multitude of different actions as part of an adaptive management program, and so we might. We've got the monitoring data. We might say, okay, based on the monitoring data, things are not okay. We have unacceptable impacts. We need to apply one or more actions to fix this problem. It might be, creating sustainable trails or marking sustainable trails or education with the visitors, probably all of the above, right? And we implement those different actions, and then we continue our monitoring. And if we're successful, then great. Pat yourself on the back, buy yourself a beer, and go celebrate. But if we're not successful, we need to do more actions. We need to get more people out there doing more maintenance, perhaps. And we keep on adding these actions or trying to do them more effectively until the monitoring data suggests to us that we've had success, that we're achieving our objectives. And then we can relax. But clearly right now, you're not there right now. I don't think, not from the data I've seen at least. A little bit about a study or two that we've done. Again, going back to Potomac Gorge, we created a really nice trailhead sign for them here. You can take a look at that. I think this whole thing is being recorded. You can refer back to this later. But here's one of our signs that talked about all the rare plants and what you can do as a hiker and so on and so forth. And we put these out along the trail at the trailheads, out on the formal trail where we had literally 150 places where people were stepping off the formal trail onto informal visitor created trails. We put a log across each one of those 150 places with a small little prompter sign on it. That's this prompter sign here, symbolic, because you got people with different nationalities using this trail. It's near DC. Then we did a little bit of work on each of these informal trails, generally just the first 30 feet, where we kind of threw down a bunch of organic litter and some sticks and rocks and made them look as natural as we could. 2 people, 5 minutes of work. That's all we could afford because, again, there were 150 of these places. Here's another study where we worked at Acadia National Park on a number of their subalpine peaks there and trying to protect you. Once you come out of the tree line up onto these mountainous peaks, you get into low shrubs and blueberry and things like that, and people start walking everywhere because they can. And it's it's in subalpine vegetation where it's just very sensitive. You got very thin soils over rock, and once you lose that very, very thin layer of vegetation, the soils, which are only a few inches deep, they erode away very quickly in the next rainstorm almost. And so they're trying to get people to stay on the established formal trails. And so we have a sign here and a different kind of a prompter sign here. And in both cases, we did studies of the efficacy of our various actions. It was an experimentally designed study, and we've published journal papers, and those could be sent to you as well. I'm almost done here. And then finally, at the summit themselves, at each of these summits, you're going to have these sort of larger areas of disturbance where people, they get to the summit and then they hang out for a while. And you could have large groups doing this or repeated groups over the day. And so you often get these sort of, campsite-like, type places at the summits that can get quite large, quite frankly. They certainly do in Acadia National Park and other areas that I've been, like the Adirondacks. So as you get very high use, you really start, and particularly when you have rare plants or animals involved, is you've got to then move to a higher level of action. And here's an area that I consulted with that's pretty close to my home. It's called Buffalo Mountain Preserve, and it's in Virginia here. And they ended up putting up these steel sort of fence type posts and then ran line. It's I think they used like polypropylene 1/2-inch line. And in the first 2 years, it only got cut twice by the visitors, and they just tied it back together. So it's been very effective. They periodically hang on these fence lines, small sort of prompter signs asking people to obey, and stay within the designated trails that run along the summits to various vistas. Now, it's my understanding that you don't have as many vistas in this area, and so maybe this isn't necessary, but maybe if you did, you would need to have, sort of a network of fenced trails like this. And quite frankly, they're just sort of symbolic fences. They're not, I mean, you could easily step over these things, right? But they've been highly effective. And they also have a sign at the summit that talks about, some of these problems and tries to communicate to the visitors the concerns that managers have for rare plants and rare wildlife. And why it's sort of there's a compelling need to stick to the formal trails and not engage in a lot of off-trail trampling. And so, and they anchor these things in rock generally to make them, more sustainable and long-lasting. But it was very effective, highly effective. I, took a lot of photos. I've got a lot more photos. But at any rate, that's the conclusion of my talk, and hopefully we have some time. I'm happy to stick around as long as is requested to answer questions. But I guess, Catherine, do you want to start perhaps posing some questions or some discussion?
Absolutely. And Jeff, if you would take your screen share down,
Yep.
that way we can kind of popcorn some questions around here, because I think I've gotten a couple in the Q&A widget, which is, by the way, great place to drop your questions right now as we go through here. I've gotten a couple that I want to send Pine's way. One of the themes here is kind of what is DEC thinking about, and what are some of the next steps when it comes to the process for managing visitors here on the formerly trailless peaks in the Catskills?
I think the next steps, it's to evaluate the data that we've collected over the summer and analyze that very closely. What we're interested in finding is any information that indicates that certain areas should be avoided because of certain resource conditions. And then I think what the preliminary or interim management strategy that we'll probably look to use is to identify areas where we want to discourage use. And then also one of the things that I didn't have a chance to talk about it in my presentation, but the data that we collected this summer using Survey 123, integrated point assessments, where we started looking at the trail slope alignment angles on given points along these informal trails. We measured trail width. So we started collecting inventory indicator data related to soil loss. And so we have, based on the point assessments, a pretty general sense of where trails are slightly sustainable or acceptably sustainable for interim, maybe identifying routes along those segments that could be used before we, potentially move to a stronger, more permanent management solution for those areas. So it's going to be an adaptive monitoring and management approach where we'll implement, monitor, and evaluate the efficacy of any of the choices that we end up selecting throughout the course of the visitor use management process and the public engagement process.
And somebody was asking about the public engagement process. What is the best way for people to be involved in this?
Well, that's a great question. And we do have a webpage right now that's set up for the Catskill Trailless Peaks. It has all of the baseline data reports that have been produced since 2019. It also has much more extensive analysis of the canister sign-in rates. And it has an email address where you can email your questions, your comments on this process, where we've been accepting public comment since June. It's open-ended. So the email address, I believe, is catskillpark@dec.ny.gov. And if you do a quick Google search for the Catskill Visitor Use Management Project, that page will come right up.
Great. And I'll make it even easier for everybody by saying we'll send out an email. We have everybody who registered give us their email address. We'll send out an email that's got links to those pages and that has that that email address in it so that you can reach out to DEC directly. We also have a whole host of questions in the Q&A around what types of activities have the most impact. People are wondering, you know, is winter activity more impactful? Is it better to be out there snowshoeing so that we're reducing impacts? How do we feel about dogs, mountain bikes? What are, you know, just kind of what are the more and less impactful activities that we're seeing out on some of these informal trail networks?
I'll answer that really quickly, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, go for it. So some of the more impactful seasons in terms of wildlife impacts are certainly the springtime. There's a number of ground nesting bird species that are found in these areas. So ground nesting, so that was actually news to me when I started learning more about the species that are occupying these areas. So when they start hatching out their young in May and June, it's a particularly sensitive time for them. And it's also probably the animals can experience a greater impact should you be traveling to those areas with dogs, off leash. So that's one factor, is the timing of your visit. The mud season, obviously in March, April, depending on where you are. That also can have visitation to these areas during that time period can leave more significant impacts. And then, you know, as long as the ground is frozen in winter, the impacts are generally less adverse in the winter time. But we definitely have concerns about impacts in the spring, particularly to wildlife.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And one of the, you know, another kind of, I'm scrolling through here just to put these together, but another type of question we've got is about like the types of trails and where it seems to be most useful to be building when we're trying to push traffic in a certain direction. There's a question here about, you know, have folks tried to construct trails toward ridge tops, toward summits to channel traffic in the most exposed areas while leaving bases and leaving the climb up less managed? Is that something that's happened, or is that something that anyone would recommend?
I think from my understanding, the major concerns are on the summits where the herd path activity is becoming so densely concentrated. It's really impacting very specific habitat that is used by, you know, specialized species. Max can speak a little bit more about the lower reaches and the montane forest, you know, the lower reaches of the forest and the concerns related to that, which I think are much less. And correct me if I'm wrong, Max.
Yeah, generally, it's our feeling that because the montane forests are relatively small, and that's where people are spending most of their time, that's really where we're seeing the biggest impacts ecologically. Of course, there are local effects of the trail, but if you consider how big some of those matrix forests are, those impacts are, I don't want to negate their significance, but they're not necessarily as ecologically damaging as what you see in the summits. And it's especially in those places where you have multiple trails running through one of the mountain spruce fir, mountain fir forest, you know, where the picknose thrush might be nesting, that you get these widespread areas that are being affected by recreationists.
Thanks, Max. Jeff, this one's for you. We've got a couple of folks wondering about potential unintended impacts. If we do more to formalize trails, if we build more trails, is that going to just perpetuate more informal trails? Does more just add to more?
Yeah, good question. Well, in regards to the last question, I would add that, places of concern would be anywhere where you have fairly steep terrain and you have fall aligned, trails going up that steep terrain. Whether it's in montane forests or down at lower elevations would make relatively little difference from the impact to the trail and the soil perspective. Although you do often get higher rainfall at higher elevations. In terms of this question, building some sustainable, essentially dispersed travel works when it's at fairly low levels of use and people actually purposefully avoid when they see a path starting to form. They literally see that and go a different direction. And that would be the leave no trace practice of, kind of walking in a very dispersed way. If you see any impact, you avoid it, you go somewhere else. And but dispersed traffic only works to, fairly low level of use. And we're way beyond that now. Looking at those Strava maps, we're way beyond, the point at which dispersed travel is going to work. And so people who say, oh, I kind of like the trailless nature of these summits and I want to retain that and I want to, I like the challenge of navigating cross country to these trailless peaks and so on and so forth. And I hear you, I'm with you, but quite frankly, that just can't be done by 1,000 people. It can be done by dozens of people, but not thousands of people. And you're now at thousands of people. You're beyond that point. There's no question in my mind that you have to, give it up, unless you want to control people and visitation, unless you want to start offering, okay, we're going to give 50 permits per day, to hike a given, trailless summit. If you're willing to go there, then yeah, you could continue your old style management. But if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to limit use, then I would say that certainly in the higher use peaks and summits, you really have to have sustainably designed trails constructed from the parking lot to the summit and back again.
Will those constructed trails will that lead to additional? Do we have any indication of if that will lead to more off trail and informal?
Not typically. I mean, that's where you can start getting into the visitor education and management, where you tell people, hey, folks, you really need to stay on the sustainably designed trail that we've provided for you, because you are walking through the habitat of, sensitive plant communities and rare, wildlife species like the Bicknell rush and so on and so forth. And generally that works. I mean, the folks who hike are generally, they dearly love the protected lands that they're visiting. They want to protect it. They're an easy audience for education by and large. They tend to be highly educated. They tend to be, willing to, go the extra mile to protect the land. And so if you communicate effectively to them that off-trail traffic is a problem and give them compelling reasons, they will generally stay on the trails. Other than, once you get to the summit and they got lots more free time and they're spending, kind of running around the summit, then you may have to go to, that fencing that I was talking about. But, particularly if it's an open summit, it looks to me like these are all closed and forested summits. And so I think my Buffalo Mountain example probably may not be necessary. I don't know. You might just need to have some sort of borders on the size of the summit, kind of clearing. In other words, does that summit clearing at the very top need to really be more than a 20 by 20 foot area? Couldn't you put up some log boundaries to define a 20 by 20 foot spot and everyone needs to stay there? Again, it's containment. It's a concentration strategy with designated trails and designated sort of resting summit spots. And the name of the game is to keep the footprint of the trails and the resting spots as small as you possibly can. And, whether you have to use logs or rocks, scree walls to make a border around those summit spots, or fencing, with a few signs saying, hey, folks, help us out, stay within the fence or stay within the scree wall or the log borders, to protect, again, these plants and animals.
Thank you. And then, this might be a Pine question. It might be Jeff, might be Max. There's a great question in the chat about private property, because so much of some of the land that we're talking about is private property. How can we engage, or how is the department considering engaging those folks in this protection and preservation as well? Or how can we, if we don't have a firm answer on how will we yet?
I'll just jump in and say that there were 2 trailless peaks that were previously on private property that have since been, public use has been closed to those areas, and that was Double Top and Graham. Those Double Top coincidentally did have a very high occurrence of rare plant species, which we did discover were being bisected by some informal trails. But that the public no longer has permission to access those peaks. It's closed to public use. And so the peaks that we're talking about in the study are all under state ownership. So there is a peak in close proximity to private land, and that is South Double Top. And we have observed there is some Strava heat map information that indicates people are trespassing, because the boundary line is so close to the summit. And so, yeah, we're aware of that, but all the peaks that we're talking about in our study today are state-owned land and not on private land.
Great, thank you for clarifying. I misunderstood, so thank you for clarifying that.
Quick comment on that is that, using these new phone apps, when people are using them for navigation, you can very easily show in the phone app that, hey, here's a tract of land that's in the area that you're recreating that is privately owned. And when your little blue dot that's you on that map goes into that private land, damn well that you're now on private property and you should get out. So it's there are some advantages of having this new phone app navigation thing that everyone's adopting. Some managers hate it, but quite frankly, from my perspective, there are some real distinct advantages. That's one of them.
Got it. Great. Well, thank you. A lot of the remaining questions are folks sharing some of their thoughts on the topic, which is really wonderful to see. And I would encourage everybody, if you want to get to it real quick tonight, Google over to find the DEC's Informal Trails and the Catskills webpage, and you can grab the email address off of there to send your thoughts there. And we will look forward to continuing this conversation. I know our partners over at DEC are very, very, very interested in hearing from everybody. So please do share your thoughts and your information over there. With that, I think I'll just thank our panelists. We went a bit over this evening, and we appreciate so much your generosity of your time. Max, Pine, Jeff, thank you for just sharing all of your expertise and the work that you have done to protect the peaks here in the Catskills, and Jeff all over. It's really, really wonderful to learn from your experience. And it's been really great to hear how New York is thinking about these peaks and these really special places in the Catskills. So I will just say thank you so very, very much to all of our participants. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been great to have you. Great questions in the chat. And we will certainly be following up in the next couple of days. We're going to be getting this recording up online on the Mountain Keeper website. We'll share out a link in an email along with contact information and follow-up conversation from here. So thank you so much to everybody for your time this evening. It's been great to have you all, and have a wonderful evening.
Great.